Hey, what's up, my people? I'm so happy you guys are back. Thank you for supporting my channel, Hill Tribe Storyteller. My name is Z, and I'm glad that you guys have enjoyed my stories so far. I hope you guys enjoy the first chapter of The Misadventures of Zha and are ready to hear more this week. I know that my stories might not be the same as the one you might have heard before from other storytellers, but remember, these are oral stories, and they have been passed down from my parents to me and from their parents to them. So they're subject to change. I hope that by recording them to YouTube, I'll be able to share these stories with you, along with my kids, and hopefully one day my grandkids. And I appreciate you guys taking the time to join me this week for another episode of The Misadventure of Zha. So, on this week's Misadventure of Zha, I'll be telling the second story, or what I like to call Chapter 2. The name of this next story is called Trail Duties for Zha. And I hope you all enjoy this next story just as much as you did the first one. So let's see what's in store for King and Zha this week. A long, long time ago, there was a man named Zha. And we all know that Zha is quite the trickster and very intelligent. But aside from being very smart, Zha was also very lazy. He loved to sleep more than anything in the world. And King knew this. Zha often would be the last one in the village to get up to tend to his garden and livestock. Most days the villagers would have already been up to tend to their rice field while Zha was still fast asleep. By the time he woke up some days, the other villagers would have already fed their chickens and pigs and taken their cows to graze on the green pasture on the other side of the mountains already. However, this did not bother Zha, but it did bother King. Since that day, that Zha outsmarted King by telling him that bogus story about the anthill, King has been thinking of a way to get back at Zha. King thought to himself, how can a lowlife like Zha make a fool out of me? He's nobody, and I'm the king. So he came up with a wonderful idea. He'll just work Zha to the bones. This way, Zha wouldn't have any energy to outsmart him or anyone else for that matter. So the next day, King summoned his servant and commanded them to go to Zha's house to demand that Zha come to the palace so that he could have a word with Zha. One of his servants replied, King, don't you remember the last time we went and got Zha? He came and told you that bogus story and made a fool out of you, man. I don't think it's a good idea, bro. Silence, said King. Just go get him. So King's servant ran over to Zha's house. They knocked on the door and said, Zha, King wants to have a word with you. You gotta come to the palace later, or you'll be executed. Have a good day. Zha chuckled and told him he'll swing by later. Tell that to the king. Later that day, Zha waited until the sun was just about to set when he headed over to the palace. When he arrived, King was like, welcome, welcome, Zha. What brings you to my humble home? Zha's like, cut the crap, King. Didn't you summon me? And King was like, yes. Yes, I did. Have a seat, Zha. Zha sat down and asked, what do you want, King? And King replied, well, I would like you to do some community service and give back to our community. Zha asked, what kind of community service, King? And King replied, I would like you to help my servant tidy up the trails around the village to make it easier for everyone to get around. Knowing that this is going to be a labor-intensive task, Zha proceeded to state that he did not know how to do trail maintenance, so it would probably be better for King to ask someone else. King insisted that it had to be Zha, because everyone else was busy tending to their fields, and they'd done their share of community service, all except Zha. Zha refused and started to pretend sob all over the palace floor, and King saw this and came up with what he thought was a pretty good idea. Knowing that Zha loves to sleep more than anything else, King said, get up, Zha. You're making a fool of yourself. Here, I'll make you a deal. If by the time my servant arrives at your house and the sun is over your head, then you have to go clear the trails with them. However, if the sun is below your head, then you don't have to go. Deal? Zha thought to himself, darn it, I love to sleep in. How am I going to get out of this one? King interrupted Zha's thought and reminded him that if his servant arrives and the sun was over Zha's head, then Zha would have to go with them, or he'll be in big trouble. Zha agreed and went home. That night, Zha set his alarm clock to before sunrise. He knew that the king's servants weren't lazy, so they'll probably be up, arriving at his house before sunrise. When his alarm went off that morning, it took every ounce of strength just to get out of bed. After he got up, Zha climbed to the tallest peak on the roof of his house and waited for king's servants to arrive. When they arrived, they knocked on his door, but no one answered. Instead, a voice came from above. It was Zha. He was straddled on top of his roof, yelling and waving at them. Zha hollered, "Good morning, bros. What are you guys doing up so early?" They replied, "We're here to get you to go clean up the trails with us. Remember?" Zha replied back, "Good luck with them trails. I'm not going with you guys." One of the servants replied, "Why not? Don't you remember what King said?" Zha answered, "Yes, I do remember what King said. King said that if the sun was over my head by the time you guys arrive, then I'll go with you. But as you can see, the sun is not over my head, so I'm not going." The king's servant squinted at the sun, which was barely over the horizon, then back at Zha, who was sitting high on top of his roof. Indeed, the sun was lower than Zha's head. They couldn't do anything to convince Zha to go with them, because he was right. King did say that if the sun was lower than Zha's head, then he didn't have to go. So they left without him. After they left, Zha climbed down and went back to sleep. Later that day, when the servants came back, after a long day of clearing trails, King asked them if Zha had gone with them. One of the servants replied, "No," and King asked why. The servant explained to King that they had gone to Zha's house early that morning to find Zha sitting on top of the highest peak on his roof. When they asked Zha if he was going to come down to go to work with them, he refused. He reminded them that King had said that if the sun was higher than his head when they arrived, then he would go with them. However, the sun was just rising and therefore it was lower than his head, so he refused to go with them. King became furious. "Darn it, Zha, being a wise guy again, huh?" hollered King. He then ordered his servant to go fetch Zha for the second time. The servant scurried to Zha's house. Out of breath, they knocked on Zha's door and said, "Zha, King wants you to come to the palace now. He's pissed off that you didn't go clear the trails with us today." And Zha was like, "Oh, okay. You guys go ahead and I'll be right behind you." Hours later, Zha finally arrived at the palace. King was pacing back and forth. When he saw Zha entered, he yelled, "Zha, didn't I tell you to go and help my servants clear up the trails today?" Zha replied, Yes, you did." This made King even more mad. "So why didn't you?" hollered King. "Well, King, you see, I just did what you said. You said that if the servant arrived and the sun was over my head, then I would have to go with them. But you see, the sun wasn't over my head when they arrived, so I didn't go," replied Zha. King thought about it and said, "Well, I did say that, but I thought your lazy butt wouldn't be able to get up before the sunrise. That's when I said what I said." Zha laughed and said, "Joke's on you, bro. I'm not as lazy as you thought." King was even more upset now. He had to think of another way to outsmart Zha, to get him to go clear those trails with his servant. Then he hatched a brilliant idea. He said to Zha, "Well, since you're so industrious, I have another challenge for you. If you can be up before the roosters crow, then you don't have to go work on the trails. However, if you're up after the roosters crow, you're going to have to go work on those trails with my servant. Deal?" Zha thought about it and agreed. Then Zha headed home. King quickly rallied up his servant and instructed them to wait until the first rooster had crowed before going over to Zha's house. This will ensure that Zha will be up after the rooster had crowed. The next day, the servants waited until the first rooster had crowed and headed to Zha's house. When they arrived, Zha was up and waiting for them outside. They were puzzled to see Zha standing there with a string tied around his rooster's neck. They asked Zha if he was ready to go to work with them. Again, Zha told them that he was not going to clear the trails with them. One of the servants says, "You have to go. Remember, King said that if you were up after the rooster had crowed, then you have to go." Zha replied, "Are you sure? You see, bro, I'm standing here in front of this here rooster, so am I not up before the rooster?" The servant looked at each other and agreed. Yes, Zha was in fact standing up before his rooster. Then Zha took a step and yanked on the string, forcing the rooster to crow. He took another step and did the same thing, forcing the rooster to crow again. and again. Zha then looked at the king's servant and said, "There you have it, bro. I'm up before the roosters crow. Therefore, by king's words, I'm not going with you guys." The servants replied, "Well, if that's the case, then you're going to have to explain it to king later." And they left. Zha untied his rooster and went back to bed. Later that day, the servants came back, exhausted from a long day of work. To their surprise, King was waiting for them, waiting to ask them if Zha had gone with them to work on those trails. One of the servants told King that they waited until the first rooster had crowed, just like he instructed, to go over to Zha's house. But when they arrived, Zha was already up, with a string tied around his rooster's neck, waiting for them. When asked if Zha was going to go with them, Zha said no. He explained to King that Zha stated that King said that if he was up before the roosters crow, then he didn't have to go. Zha demonstrated this by walking around, yanking his rooster with the string that he had tied around the rooster's neck, thus causing the rooster to crow. By the time Zha was done, the poor rooster looked like a ragged feather duster. Technically, Zha was right. He was up before the roosters crow, explained the servant. This made King boil over like a hot tea kettle. "Darn it, Zha," yelled King. He ordered his closest servant to go and fetch Zha for the third time. He needed to have a word with this wise guy. The king's servant went over to Zha's house as quickly as possible and pounded on his door. Zha opened up the door and asked, "What's all the commotion?" The servant said, "King wanted to have a word with you, bro. He seems really pissed off, so you better hurry." Zha followed the servant back to the palace. It was almost dark by the time they arrived. King was pacing back and forth, just steaming like a fresh rice cake. When Zha arrived, King was like, "Zha, what's this I hear about you not going to work on the trails with my servant? And about you dragging a poor rooster behind you, forcing him to crow, making him look like an old feather duster?" Zha replied, "Well, you see, King, wasn't it you who said that if I was up before the roosters crow, then I didn't have to go work on the trails?" King sighed and said, "Yeah, I did say that, but I didn't think you'd literally be up dragging a rooster behind you." Zha laughed and said, "So technically, I was up before the roosters crow, so that's why I didn't go." This made King even more mad. "No more games," yelled King. "Tomorrow, you're going to go work on those trails no matter what. Got it?" Zha nodded and dismissed himself from the palace and went home. That night, Zha pondered on how he was going to get out of trail work the next day. Looking at his raggedy rooster, he came up with another idea. That morning, Zha got up bright and early and plucked all the feathers off his old hen. He cleaned her up real nice and packed her up with some rice and wrapped it all in banana leaves. He then placed her in his lunch bag just as the king's servants arrived. As they got closer to the trail, Zha asked the servant if they wouldn't mind if he had some breakfast before they started their day. They looked at each other and said, "Why not? It's going to be a long day anyways. Breakfast wouldn't be a bad idea." As they sat down by the trail, Zha reached into his lunch bag and grabbed his banana-wrapped lunch. Just as he was about to open his package, the banana leaf burst open, and a naked hen popped out. His hen took off between the servants, causing a commotion while Zha's hollering, "Help! Help! Help catch my breakfast!" Everyone scrambled and dove after the naked hen like a loose football at a Sunday game. At the same time, Zha was screaming at the top of his lungs, "Bad omen! This is a bad omen! We're all gonna die, guys!" After the dust settled and the hen took off into the thick jungle, the king's servant gathered around Zha and asked, "What was this bad omen you speak of, Zha?" Zha smirked and told him that he had butchered that hen fresh that morning, boiled it, and packed it with the rice. He was hoping to share it with everyone, but since the chicken came back from the dead, it was a sign of a bad omen. Zha told him that he needed to go home and bring his bad juju with him, or else it might cost the rest of the crew to have bad luck that day. The servants agreed. Zha went home and went back to bed. Later that day, the servants returned. King was patiently waiting for them, knowing that today was the day that he would outsmart Zha and finally be able to work Zha to the bones. As they entered the palace, King asked them one by one if Zha showed up to work. They said yes, but... King was furious. "What do you mean? Yes, but... ... yelled King. One of the servants replied, Well, Zha did show up for work, but when we got to the site, Zha asked if he could have some breakfast before we started. We all thought it wasn't a bad idea to get some food in our stomach, so we sat down to eat. When Zha opened up the lunch that he packed, his spoiled chicken got up and ran off into the jungle. Zha said that this was a bad omen, and he demanded that he return home. He said that if he didn't take his bad juju with him, it would bring bad luck to the rest of us. So he headed home, and we continued working on the trail for the rest of the day. By this time, King was raging mad, pulling at his hair, screaming, "Darn you, Zha!" Eventually, King calmed down. He accepted defeat. He no longer tried to make Zha work on the trails. Instead, he was spending his time conjuring up a more devious plan to make Zha's life miserable. So, I guess the moral of this story is you gotta work smarter and not harder. If you don't want to work hard like Zha, then you gotta be smarter than your opponent. So, if you guys want to find out what King has in store for Zha, you gotta join me next week. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel, Hill Tribe Storyteller. And again, thank you for joining me this week. I'll see you next story.